I want to talk here about one of the things that drives me most in terms of passion, in terms of conviction, in terms of interest. That is the subject of human rights. Now, as we've become an interconnected world, with each decade this becomes a more prominent issue in some ways. It's not necessarily that the situation is getting better or worse. There has been a lot of progress that needs to be acknowledged. It's more that, and in some areas there's been a decline as well, so it's never, I think it's very difficult to ever judge a world situation a bit like War and Peace, because in some areas the situation gets better, in some areas it gets worse. But I have noticed that there's been something of a backlash to concern about human rights and discussion about human rights, in that the word itself has become somewhat slandered. The words, I should say. The history of human rights goes way, way, way back. It is actually not a 20th century concept, although in the 20th century it became certainly a more prominent issue and it started to be more recognised. But it's actually not true that this is something that was only invented in modern times. There are mixed reports suggesting that going as far back as Cyrus the Great in ancient Iran, there was the world's first human rights document. That is a subject of debate, but if it's true, then that certainly shows that this is an ancient concept. Throughout history there's always been moves by various governments, various movements and so on, to attain some sort of human progress, but that hasn't always been matched by the concept of liberty. Throughout history there's many examples of what human rights actually means, and there's a very good video on this about, it's simply called The Story of Human Rights. I'll put a link if I can, but it's quite easy to find because it's got a lot of views, simply called The Story of Human Rights, and that sort of states how different countries at different times have had different perceptions of what human dignity, human liberty means. You have the English Bill of Rights, going way back to Magna Carta in 1215. You have the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the American Revolution for that matter. You have all these sort of movements, and it isn't just in Western countries. You have great leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi, Kim Dae-jung in South Korea, who were tireless campaigners for civic liberty. Gandhi indeed in India. But one thing I've noticed is that this backlash has sort of taken the form of trivializing human rights, to the point where the word itself almost becomes stigmatized. There's a few misconceptions about the idea of human rights that I want to confront. Firstly, I think one reason for this, even in countries that have democracy and values that you would think would correlate with respect for human rights, the word itself has become contentious. In Britain, for example, when we talk about human rights, very often those on the political right react to it in the way of specifically thinking about the European Court of Human Rights, although that has been helped out British citizens many times, in the sense that we look at it as defending the guilty. For example, if you have a rapist who happens to be a foreign citizen, European law would dictate that that person has a right to stay in the UK. Because of rulings like that, human rights then gets a bad image. Now, I share the frustration of those people. I do think it is a fallacy that such people should be allowed to basically enjoy our democracy and liberty when they have terrorised British citizens. But human rights is for everyone, so the point I'm making with that is that it is decisions like that that then slander human rights generally, when actually human rights is a very good thing. I also want to counter the idea that I think is out there that this is somehow a namby-pamby liberal thing, or that you need to be on the political left to believe in it. I regard myself as a political centrist, and on issues like crime I'm pretty conservative actually, as my recent videos on Norway would testify. But that doesn't mean that I then take the other extreme of, for example, wanting criminals to live in inhumane conditions and so on. I think that human rights is not a left-wing or right-wing issue. It is a fundamental human issue, at least it should be. And it is unfortunate that the term is being slandered. That's because some human rights rulings in Europe are ridiculous, when there actually is very legitimate human rights issues out there. Now, sometimes I look online at videos about dictators. Just to cite an example, I came across a Journeyman video. Journeyman is a sort of freelance group of journalists who travel around the world and report on issues that don't generally get reported on. This was about Turkmenbashi, the former Turkmen dictator. He died a few years ago. He had a pretty brutal regime. Predictably, there were comments under that, with one guy coming out and saying, oh, you fucking Western media, you always say this, you always say that, we love him, blah blah blah. These sort of responses are predictable. In part, they're based on nationalism. I think nationalism very often is a barrier to human rights progress, because countries that frequently come under scrutiny, especially countries like China, Arab states, and Central Asian states, African states for that matter, very often when those states come under scrutiny for their human rights record, it is met by nationalistic rebuttals, such as, oh, this is some sort of American conspiracy to get oil in our region, or it's an American conspiracy to discredit us, or so on. The retort is always about pointing out the problems or perceived problems with American foreign policy. Now, I take issue with this because you have to differentiate human rights from American foreign policy. They're not one and the same thing. So, unfortunately, a lot of people seem to think that whenever human rights is discussed by the Western media is somehow acting as stooges for the American government. Well, that's flawed, because very often the BBC has been critical of American foreign policy. But even if you want to go down that route and say, oh, it's all bias, it's all propaganda, whatever way you look at it, there are human rights issues out there. So let's say, for the sake of argument, American concerns about human rights are purely political, and they don't really care. And it's purely political, it's purely about geopolitical control. I think there might be some truth in that. I mean, politics is power, it always has been, it always will be. So whilst there are legitimate humanitarian concerns, I think there will be power chess going on. Okay. But that doesn't mean that the concerns are not valid concerns. It doesn't mean that torture isn't happening. It doesn't mean that there are not brutal regimes persecuting dissidents. Just because the Americans are concerned, and I focus on the Americans because they're the superpower. You know, that sometimes Britain and France are also criticising other Western countries, but the focus is primarily on America. One thing I would say about that, I don't believe the United States is wonderful itself in terms of human rights. I mean, the American prison system, you have people in solitary confinement for days on end. You have the American police, who I believe have far too much power. As we've seen from Ferguson, Missouri, there's huge issues with American police power. So America, in my opinion, is very far from being a world leader on human rights. It's certainly not the worst, and it certainly is a lot better than some of the brutal dictatorships in Central Asia. But the US of A is not a world leader in human rights. So just because someone is speaking up for human rights does not mean that they're going to be a stooge of all things American. I can certainly think of many reasons to criticise the United States. Indeed, I can think of many reasons to criticise the United Kingdom. Again, we are not perfect when it comes to human rights. The Conservative Party's welfare policies, I would argue, are definitely violating some basic human rights, such as forcing people into forced labour. I do think that is an attack on civic liberty. The Conservative Party's welfare policies have literally driven people to suicide. So it's not a case of the West boasting about how great Western countries are, because we're not perfect. Far from it. But unfortunately, nationalism comes into this. When people hear their country being criticised, they automatically get defensive and nationalistic, instead of just maybe standing back and considering, actually, we do have problems with this. Now, I think part of progress in this would be, as Westerners, to acknowledge that we do have problems. So for my part, I shouldn't get nationalistic either. And if people are pointing out fallacies within Western countries, we should admit that and say, yes, this is a problem, we're not perfect, and we also need to deal with this. But one thing about human rights, it is universal. It is not something that countries should pick and choose. And if countries are violating it, they should be scrutinised. Of course they will get nationalistic, of course they will get defensive, of course they'll talk about meddling Western media. But with all that being said, that shouldn't stop people speaking out and saying this is wrong and needs to be condemned. I think there is far too much emphasis put on the sovereignty issue. Although sovereignty is very important, and I don't trivialise it, I think far too often it is used as an excuse for authoritarian regimes to do what they want. I made a video recently on stoning in Brunei. That's going to be brought into their penal system. Now, a lot of Bruneians, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the correct adjective is, but a lot of people from Brunei got very defensive and says, oh, you know nothing about our country, how dare you disrespect our Sultan. A word here, I don't give a damn about offending people if all I am doing is critiquing an issue which I believe is barbaric or an attack on human rights. I love China, but I will not hesitate to criticise the Chinese Communist Party, and if that offends Chinese people, that's unfortunate. It's not my intention. Believe me, I do not make videos trying to stir people up. I don't. But it just so happens that some of the subjects I happen to cover will inevitably stir people up. It's like Thailand's lèse-majesté law. I can think of a lot of Thais. I've actually got death threats from some of these morons because they react from a nationalistic perspective or from an extreme royalist perspective that they cannot see just how absurd their argument is. So, like I've said before, I don't do political correctness. I don't really care about offending people in my videos. I don't go out my way to offend people. I don't do it for the sake of it. I just say what I feel needs to be said. So, I find it very hard to have any patience with people who make excuses for things that really cannot be excused, things like torture. And by the way, this is not in any way a racist thing, if anyone's thinking that, because I have come across Westerners who make excuses for it, and they drive me crazy. I can understand people who are living in one of these regimes and maybe don't have much of a choice because they're not in a position to criticise the regime at hand. But when you have people, whether it be overseas students coming to study here or Westerners who whinge all the time and take democracy for granted and actually think that there's no problem with some of the things that is happening in totalitarian states, those people I have very, very little patience for. Why? Because they're enjoying freedom of expression, and they're using that freedom of expression to make excuses for something that really, really cannot be excused. So, in a perfect world, I would be thinking, oh yeah, all countries can do whatever they want, and it's I'm not going to say anything, it's not my business. But I'm a human being, and I simply respond emotionally to human suffering. And if I think something's wrong, I will say so. I have no intention of isolating myself. I have no intention of insulting anyone. I have no intention of coming across as hostile to any specific country. In fact, I don't regard myself as anti any country, but I just happen to oppose some of the severe human rights abuses that take place in those countries. So am I anti-Saudi Arabia? Am I anti-Sudan? Am I anti-China? Am I anti-Brunei? No, 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 I'm not. But I just happen to take issue with some of the severe human rights abuses that take place in those countries, and in many countries for that matter. In the United States, in Britain as well. I'm objective. If I see problems at home, I will be just as forceful in speaking out against those. In fact, as a matter of fact, look through my videos if you think I'm biased. I've made plenty of videos critical of the British Conservative Party, so if you think I'm being biased, then you're wrong. I just find it sad that so many people cannot see that something like torture is just wrong. Or sending someone to jail simply for having an opinion, or harassing people simply for having political views. Those are basic human rights violations, and they should not be happening in the 21st century. Sadly, they do. So long as human rights violations are taking place in this world, I'm not making myself out to be some sort of saint or monk-like figure. I'm just a human being, and of course I care. And I will continue to speak out.